Hey guys, so we are going to be just talking about A Long Way Gone really shortly, really briefly, uh, by Ishmael Bae. Hopefully this sounds familiar. You guys were to read the first two chapters of this nonfiction piece of work. There's my little index card to keep us on track. So really what I want to focus on is, yes, what's going on in this text, but I really want to for us to frame this in terms of how nonfiction employs the same craft elements that we've been reading about as it relates to fiction, poetry, and dramatic writing. And so when we talked about, wait for it, Persepolis, we talked about how the author had to utilize imagery, voice, right? The voice of Persepolis is very irreverent, and that was an artistic choice in order to maintain readers' interest. We also talked about how there needs to be a manipulation of truth or a manipulation of the way the truth is given. Um, there's no clear way to identify what parts of this novel and also Persepolis are 100% accurate and what parts are exaggerated because we don't have the luxury of living with the author and verifying truths from exaggerated truths. But it's important to understand when you see a use of craft elements like plot, character, voice, imagery, there is some sort of manipulation going on. Whether it impacts the credibility of what's being said, that is something that you can maybe do some research on or maybe argue, either whatever way you choose to position yourself. My biggest concern is understanding how craft elements are so important that they're also utilized in things that are 100% nonfiction. And so if you are wanting to be a journalist or you're going to be writing papers, understanding craft elements and what they can do, I think is easier to really connect with when we're reading nonfiction. These are all stories of real time, real places, real wars, real people. And so to see how voice and plot is being used is really interesting and I think fascinating to maybe do a larger paper on if you choose to. Okay, wait, this is not supposed to be it. Technical difficulties. All right, so we're moving on from our general conversation. Please do keep in mind when you are reading Persepolis or rereading Persepolis and the first two chapters, what makes something nonfiction if they're utilizing the same devices as a piece of fiction, a piece of poetry, a piece of dramatic writing. That's always something that academics like to debate about. Perhaps, I mean, it's kind of boring to do it for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's still something that's relevant and something that I would like you to consider. Um, because if the goal is to, and I guess I should put this back up, if the goal is to have readers um, understand some sort of truth, then isn't that what fiction, poetry, and dramatic writing do as well? And so if that's the case, aren't fiction and nonfiction sort of, don't they go hand in hand? So that's just something to consider. Now we're going to start talking about the actual book. So you'll notice that the book starts off with a conversation, and I'm not going to be able to sort of show you that clearly, but what the hey, I'll try. So you'll see the first chapter we have uh, a map of where this story is taking place and an excerpt of a conversation that happened in 1998. And so my first question for you guys is why start the conversation? Why start the book with a conversation between friends that's happening in 1998? And remember, the question that's being asked is really having to do with plot. So plot is the sequence of events. And so if the author chose to start us off with this, that means he's utilizing the craft element of plot. So the first question I want you guys to ask, and this will be in the discussion board, is why start this entire story with a conversation between friends? What's the impact of that? Okay. The next thing that's really interesting is we have, when we're reading the conversation, insight into who these friends are and their voice. And so you'll notice, and again, this is on the first page. So the friends are like, you mean you saw people running around with guns and shooting each other? Yes, all the time. And the friends say, cool. And so there's a really interesting dynamic between the main character's relationship with um, his history and the relationship his friends have with his history. There's mention later on about his friends sort of acting as though their ancestors discovered Africa, and because they discovered Africa, in some ways they also discovered him. And so it's really interesting how he coyly and sometimes even humorously deals with the issue of East versus West. And if you remember a long time ago, way back when, there was a video called One Story by Chibi. It was a TED Talks video where she mentioned the danger in this single story and the idea of Africa being a continent of a bunch of different countries, not one single story. And so here again, we have this idea of um, the main character feeling as though there is one story that his friends want him to talk about. And it almost seems as though, not that I want you to, you know, only commit to what I'm saying, it almost seems as though that's why he starts the story off in this way, to really make us understand that the reason why he needs to tell his story is because he's tired of having to hear what his friends think and their version of what he really experienced. So again, the cool is really important because it helps us understand the different perspectives, particularly Africa versus the U.S., West versus Africa, however you want to frame it. Okay, then we have the first paragraph of the first chapter. Now, if you go to the first chapter, we are introduced to refugees in walking through a town that is sort of a regular town. Um, Kids are playing, people are working. And so one thing I wanted you guys to sort of analyze is how do you feel image is being used in this first paragraph and what's the impact? So we see, first we hear that there are all sorts of stories being told about the war. It wasn't until refugees started passing through our town that we began to see that it was actually taking place in our country. Families who had walked hundreds of miles told how relatives had been killed and their houses burned. Um, the children of these families wouldn't look at us and they jumped at the sound of chopping wood. So we have nervous, almost as though they have uh, PTSD symptoms, walking through this town that has not been ravaged by war or any type of battles, and they are frazzled by the normalcy of this town. And so that's an image that's sort of jarring. And why do you feel like the author chose to start us off with that image in this first chapter? Then we have mention of Rambo, bottom of the first page. The only wars I knew of were those that I had read about in books or seen in movies, such as Rambo and the one in neighboring Liberia. So again, it's interesting, and we talked about this with Persepolis, how voice is being used here, not just to set us up with a character who has a complicated uh, relationship with his heritage, his what he's done, because remember it's revealed later that he was a child soldier. But voice is also being used in a way to align him with the American reader, or even maybe just the Western reader. This idea of not feeling connected to war because it's not in your front yard, really knowing war through movies and music, that's something that the Western reader can really identify. And so one interesting thing to see is that there's an alignment that he's doing from the very beginning of his memoir. Whether that means that he's manipulating the truth, I can't tell you, but it's good to note that that is happening. Then, if you go to page 6, which is right here, um, you see at the bottom of the first paragraph on page 6, my imagination at 10 years old didn't have the capacity to grasp what had taken away the happiness of the refugees. So we didn't talk about point of view yet. I really want to do like a detailed point of view lesson, and I think right now our brains are just too overworked pre-spring break to do that. What I do want to talk about though is retrospective point of view. So feel free to forget this part. Point of view is really who is telling the story and the relationship that person has to the story that's being told, but also to the time of the story. So, all that being said, retrospective point of view means the person who's telling the story is telling the story um, way in the future. That is to say, if I were to tell you a story of my childhood, it would be retrospective point of view because me as a 20-something-year-old am telling a story of me as a 12-year-old. So it's me reflecting on my past, retrospective, reflection of past. So that being said, on page 6, we realize that this is retrospective point of view. He's acknowledging that at 10 years old, he had no idea what it would be like to experience so much grief, experience um, what the refugees experienced. And so by doing that, one, he's letting us know that he is telling this tale from the way, way, way future, and this has happened in the way, way, way distant past. But the other thing that you need to be aware of with retrospective point of view comes a layering of sort of now I know, let me tell you what I know now, or if I had known then what I know now, things would be different. Um, it's almost like this layering of lessons that the narrator wishes that he or she could have told the character that's in the story. And what's interesting to note is when you have that kind of narration, um, certain subject matter is allowed to be told. And unfortunately, I don't think this through enough. I wish I would have given you more to read, but it's fine. Later on, we realize this retrospective point of view really comes in handy because he is a child soldier, and there are some gruesome images of him being the cause of people's death. And because it's connected to this retrospective narrator who lets us know, hey, this is what I did, but I'm not necessarily proud of it. And I'm not necessarily unaware of how uh, harsh and brutal my behaviors were, the subject matter becomes okay. Um, Imagining this story without retrospective narration might be difficult, but if you reread this or just think how your experience of reading this would be if you didn't have the retrospective narration, hopefully you would come across the realization that it would feel very disconnected, and some responses might be that you felt like the character uh, just you wouldn't really understand what the character was doing or why the character was doing what he was doing. And so retrospective narration works really well in terms of connecting us to uh, character development and growth and things like that. Retrospective narration is something that's used in nonfiction a lot. And as you can imagine, the reason for that is this is nonfiction. This is something that actually happened way in the past or sometime in the past. So it works. Um, but it also happens in fiction and in poetry and in dramatic writing. And so it's interesting to see how it impacts our reading of this piece of work and then parallel it to a piece of fiction that we might read in class. Okay, just cool things that Ishmael Bai does with imagery. For me, the way that war sort of evolves in the first two chapters. It seems like war doesn't punch Ishmael in the face as we would imagine war would. I think, and I'm guilty of this, I think before having, I guess, just learned stuff, I assume that war is something that just you wake up and it happens and you've been punched in the face by it and brutalized by it and then it's done, and or it's just continuous. And so what he does here is he explains the sort of subtle nuances of a warring country, a warring nation, and how sometimes you can be slightly touched by it, then nudged, then pushed, then you're sort of forced to run away from these people that are going to either brand you or kill you. And so the slow evolution of this, I think, is another choice that Ishmael is making to sort of complicate our single story, our understanding of um, Sierra Leone and what his experience was as a child soldier. It's not that he was at one point a civilian and then he was punched by war and became a child soldier. There were gentle nudges that sort of forced him to take that route. The other cool thing was this interest or this obsession with Rapper's Delight and just rap in general. Again, I don't think we've explicitly said this quite enough, but everything that has to do with image is a plea to show the reader something versus tell them. So I can tell you I'm having a bad day, right? But if I show it to you, it's all the more relevant and all the more important. And the way I can show it to you is by giving you images of maybe me stepping in uh, dog poop or me getting a ticket. You seeing that means all the more than me saying I had a bad day. And so what I would like to pose is, what do you think the author is showing us by having these young boys be obsessed with Western music, Western clothing? Um, yeah, so what do you think the author is trying to show us there? And again, these questions will be on the discussion board, so you don't have to remember it yet. Um, then we have on page 10 the mention of things being oddly normal. And of course, I'm not going to find it, so I will not. Oh, wait, maybe I will. So on the top of page 10, after a while, we didn't know any of the people who came across the river. The day seemed oddly normal. So this post being um, part of the changing, basically seeing war, seeing people die, seeing um, babies in carriages who have been shot. Um, Ishmael, by the main character, the narrator, talks about how things seem oddly normal. And again, setting is here at play here because setting has stayed the same. So the atmosphere for the narrator has stayed the same, while the actual face of where they are has completely changed. And so this interaction that the character has with the setting is, why is it that the sun is still shining and the wind is still blowing, but the people that I see here are completely different, and what we've just experienced won't allow us to feel the same way. And so this idea of it being oddly normal, I just found really interesting and a cool way to look at setting, in that um, sometimes when you have characters who are undergoing these huge, ginormous journeys, when they look at this same setting that existed pre-journey, they interact with it in a different way. This sun, this wind now has become oddly normal, and in some ways can be quite frustrating for the narrator because he doesn't understand why no one is acknowledging this huge change that has just happened. So again, interesting. Then we have his father, and so later on in the story there's more information given about his father, but for right now on page 10 we get him saying that his stepmothers have stolen his father from him. So again, perspective when it comes to voice, the admission of his distant relationship with his father being related to his stepmother's stealing him. Um, you could do some analysis if you wanted to on that. If you were to do a psychoanalytic analysis, the fact that he believes his stepfather was stolen kind of shows uh, the ob- maybe not object, but there's a physicality, a physical value that he places on his father. It's not just an emotional relationship that he misses, but the actual physical presence of his father, and that has been stolen. Um, it can also reveal that he didn't feel like he had any input in this distant relationship that he has with his father. It was just something that happened to him, not necessarily something that he wanted or signed up for. So again, that's all through psychoanalytic reading. If you wanted to do a feminist reading of the way that he understands his father, you could do that as well. And this is just one example of when the father is mentioned, but it's a really interesting one. And I can give you, oh, I had not seen him for a while as another stepmother had destroyed our relationship again. So again, the stepmother is the reason for the relationship being destroyed. You could also say that this might indicate the narrator's denial, right? The relationship is being destroyed because of another person, not necessarily because the father has anything to do with it. So some sense of denial there too. Then we have a father being consoled when he has just lost his entire family. The father is being consoled by a woman who says, well, at least you can bury them. And I think for me, this was a very poignant part of the tale when I realized just how different um, circumstances, ooh, just how different circumstances are, just how different circumstances have become when being able to bury your loved ones is a silver lining. So just wanted to bring that up. Then we have the interrupted innocent smile on her face. This is when the narrator sees the baby who has been shot and says, you know, she was shot, but you could still see the smile on her face that was slightly interrupted when she was shot. And so in some ways, this image, and again, if you were to do psychoanalytic reading, you might say that this represents how he feels about his relationship with what's going on. He was innocent, and this is sort of, or he was a child, and this has sort of interrupted his entire existence as a child. You could also analyze this image just for the impact it has. It's just what the narrator does with imagery is amazing. Um, then we have his dream. So on page 14, he has a dream that he was shot in his side and people ran past him without helping because they were running for their lives. I tried to crawl to safety in the bushes, but from out of nowhere there was someone standing on top of me with a gun. I couldn't make out his face as the sun was against it. That person pointed the gun at the place where I had been shot and pulled the trigger. I woke up and hesitantly touched my side. I became afraid since I could no longer tell the difference between dream and reality. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I want this to be a discussion board question. Um, Dreams are super important in analysis of anything really, but especially in literature, and especially in nonfiction. So what's interesting, I don't know why I'm talking like this. So what's interesting about dreams is there's a sense of manipulation of truth and exaggeration of accessibility. Dream sequences in nonfiction tend to be very skeptical. If you think of the dreams that you have, you don't really often remember them that clearly. And just not to be nitpicky, but just in terms of, you know, writing down this dream, remembering it in such vivid detail, that kind of stuff comes up, and sort of the credibility of this dream is up for debate. But that being said, it is a dream that's brought into this narration. And so because it's a dream that's been purposefully put into this narration, I want you to look at what this reveals about the narrator and why you think the author chose to give us access to this dream, knowing what we know about how skeptical it is. Then, final point about setting. On the bottom of page 15, I closed my eyes and the images from Kabaddi flashed in my mind. I try to drive them out by evoking older memories of Kabaddi before the war. So again, his interaction with setting is very interesting in that it seems like he has a very aggressive and angry relationship with setting. In the first instance, he's mad at setting because he's like, why is everything still the same? Why isn't my atmosphere, why isn't my landscape acknowledging the change that's happening to my hometown? Here we have him trying to force out the change that setting is showing him by putting old memories of his town back into his what is memory? Well, yeah, he keeps remembering these new Kabaddi images, and he's trying to push these images out by remembering the old. And so again, he's aggressively trying to change setting, and or he's upset with setting for not changing at all. And so that dynamic and the push and pull between the two is really interesting. Then we have the mention on page 16 about the moon, where the grandma says, wait, what's the grandma? We have on the bottom, yeah. We must strive to be like the moon. An old man in Kabaddi repeated the sentence often to people who walked past his house on their way to the river to fetch water. I remember asking my grandmother what the old man meant. So again, old man says we must strive to be like the moon, and he asks his grandmother, what does it mean? And she said that people complain when there is too much sun and it gets unbearably hot, and also when it rains too much or when it is cold. But she said no one grumbles when the moon shines, and so we should all strive to be more like the moon. Question for you guys: what does the moon do that's so spectacular according to this old man and according to the grandma? Why do you think it's so significant to the circumstances that the narrator and his friends are going through? Chapter 2. Hopefully this sort of irritated you because you wanted to know more about what's going to happen, but this is where we realize that there's an image that we see with the red wheelbarrow, and we realize that the narrator has become a soldier, and he is actually carrying a dead body in his wheelbarrow. And so the question that we have to deal with is, why is there a delay of truth? Why don't we know in the beginning of the story? Of course, the title is Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. So in some respects, I kind of tricked you because I didn't tell you the whole title. But even if you knew the whole title, there's still a delay of truth. And why do you think the author chooses to do that? Why not start us off with this instant when we have the narrator lugging a dead body around? Of course, sort of the obvious answers is to let us know how he got to where he was so that we're not jaded into thinking, oh, he just became a child soldier because he wanted to. But I want you to think in terms of the author and also in terms of what the author wants the reader to feel and how the author wants the reader to interact with the narrator. So considering those 2 points, why delay the truth of the narrator being a child soldier? And memory. I think I sort of want to end with memory. Memory. So on page 19, again, I had right here, we have in the middle paragraph, we understand that he's no longer in Africa and that he's being haunted, or not haunted, He's wandering through these memories of Sierra Leone. My mind wandered across the Atlantic Ocean back to Sierra Leone. I saw myself holding an AK-47 and walking through a coffee farm with a squad that consisted of many new boys. Uh, la la la. And so we realize, oh, we're back into some sort of present day, and he is unable to really keep away from these memories of him being a child soldier and things like being with his group of friends. They still kind of ebb and flow into his now current life. And so memory is really interesting in terms of how it functions in fiction, but how it functions in nonfiction is also really interesting. What does this memory sequence, him remembering things, what does it do for you as a reader, and how does it function in the text itself? That's, I mean, a question that you can answer in the discussion board, or just something to consider. Um, how, when you were reading this, knowing that memory and the memories of his past are still haunting his, not haunting, I keep saying haunting, memories of his past are interrupting his present. What's the significance of that is something interesting to consider. And that's it for, I said it was going to be short. 31 minutes is kind of short for me. So that's all I want to talk about in terms of this text. You are now on your way to a merry spring break, hopefully. When we get back, things are going to go super duper duper fast. So please, 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 weeks 1 through week 8 should already be done sort of by now-ish. Hopefully you're watching this April 2nd or later, and so it should be completely done. That being said, now we have weeks 9, 10, and I think this is week 11. Don't get behind on these discussion boards because life and your other classes will uh, pile up and punch you in the face very, very fast as soon as you return from spring break. So if you could please, please, please use this time to, of course, enjoy your spring break, get some brain relaxation, but also to ensure that you have a clear understanding of what you need to do in order to get the A that you desperately want or should desperately want in this class. And all that really means is don't hold off on posting discussion board forums for this post and for weeks 9 and 10. I think that's pretty much it. We have one more close reading that's due after spring break and then your final paper. So one thing you might want to consider doing is working on your final close reading, and or if you know which paper, which close reading you want to extend for your final paper, start working on that. Maybe email me, give me an email saying this is what I want to work on, and hopefully we can have a conversation about that, and maybe possibly you could be done. Hopefully, maybe. Okay, so I'm not going to plan your entire life. Enjoy your spring break, and I will see you on the 13th of April. Bye.